but Robert Barnes, dare I say it, is an even more eminent one. And he joins us now. Robert, thank you for joining us. Deal with the constitutional import of the Donald Trump case first off. Because in the rest of the world, people associate incoming governments putting the last government on trial, criminalizing them, lawfaring them, as being one of the characteristics of a banana republic. The United States is now doing this for the first time. Does that mean you've become a banana republic?
Well, under the Biden administration, it would probably be appropriate, given the nature of the president himself and his mental state. But there's no question that this raises significant and serious constitutional questions we've never had to address before. As you note, America has never indicted a former president. America has never indicted the leading opponent of the existing administration. We've mostly targeted outsiders when this has happened. So it did happen to presidential candidates. Eugene V. Debs, for opposing World War I, was locked up. Now, he was still allowed to be on the ballot because you can't prohibit him from being on the ballot by indictment. But that's the closest we've come to overtly and openly weaponizing the local prosecutorial process to go after our political opposition. And we usually, as you note, make fun of it when it happens anywhere else in the world and use it as a sign that that country is not a democratic country, not a constitutional country. In the U.S., arguably our U.S. Constitution already prohibits this. It does identify when a former president can be indicted or tried or sentenced or criminally punished. And it's only after he's been impeached in the House and convicted by more than a 2/3 vote in the Senate. It then says, then you can remove him from office. Then you can remove him and bar him from future office. Then you can charge him in a criminal case. So arguably this indictment by itself violates that constitutional prohibition because there's been no conviction vote in the Senate. Trump has been twice impeached, but twice acquitted. And these charges and these claims were known before then. But this case is unique in that it involves all kinds of other constitutional issues, some of them novel, beyond the impeachment clause provision limitation on indicting former presidents, which include whether it's a due process violation for the opposite party to indict their leading opponent in the upcoming election for the presidency, whether or not a local government can do this against the interest of the nation, the issues of constitutional federalism that implicates. And then, of course, that doesn't even get to the constitutional violations of the nature of the indictment itself, because it appears to try to criminalize free speech by making any activity, a campaign donation that merely supports a campaign as an ancillary or incidental benefit, which raises First Amendment freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of press, right to petition the government issues. Then you have issues of due process of law as to whether or not they violated the statute of limitations in bringing the case, whether or not they violated giving exculpatory evidence and not providing perjured testimony and false law to the grand jury in the case, whether or not the judge has a bias in the case that's violating, and the DA, because both of them have been involved with Trump's opposition, the judge giving contributions to Biden and his family being tied to the Biden family in political ways, the prosecutor running on prosecuting Trump, which arguably violates the selective prosecution prohibition under our First Amendment. So all kinds of extraordinary constitutional issues in this unprecedented, unparalleled, banana republic-like indictment of President Trump.
Well, as you adumbrated what can only be described as a tsunami of indictments of the indictment and those bringing it, I wondered how it can possibly survive and how people with a straight face could lend their support to it. Although when Biden was asked if this was political, he actually broke out in peals of laughter. Whether he understood the question, of course, is a moot point. But nobody listening to what you've just said could be in any doubt at all that this is an absurdly, almost comically, political move.
Completely. I mean, it's terrifying. I mean, I think the Democratic response and even the nature of the indictment itself was a lot of confession through projection. I tell people if they want to know what's going on, say, in Ukraine, Take the accusations made about Russia and assume it's about the West or Ukraine, and you'll probably have an accurate testimony. If you want casualty counts, reverse the projections, and you'll probably have an accurate attestment. The same is true here. In other words, what they've indicted Trump for is what the Biden administration, what Joe Biden himself, is what Hillary Clinton, and even Barack Obama, in many respects, as testimony developed this week, are actually guilty of, which are, funneling illegal contributions, using their family to engage in institutional corruption around the globe. Hillary Clinton famously disguised her Russiagate work that was planted and laundered through the FBI to spy on the president, and not only to promote a deep state narrative to oppose any peace deal with Russia, but also to propagate an anti-Trump campaign that they knew was false from day one. And how did they do it? They disguised it as legal fees. So that's where you read the indictment, and if you applied it to Hillary Clinton, the indictment might actually make sense. If you applied it to Barack Obama, it might make sense. If you applied it to Joe Biden, it might make sense. It just makes no sense as to Donald Trump. And so there's a lot of confession through projection in the nature of these criminal charges and prosecutions. But you're right, this is not a credible prosecution, not as a matter of law. You have independent, liberal, democratic legal scholars like Professor Jonathan Turley, like Professor Alan Dershowitz, calling it the worst and weakest case they've ever witnessed. And this is the one we crossed the constitutional Rubicon for. This is the one we decided to breach our precedent of never indicting former presidents and leading presidential opponents for, was a case that Alan Dershowitz calls the weakest he's ever seen. And that's because it's also factually weak. I mean, they can't they're basically relying on a lawyer who's an admitted, self-confessed perjurer, fraudster, and liar. And he himself can't make a consistent determination as to what he did, because the prosecutor needs him to keep changing it, because their legal theory, depending on the circumstances, has to change in case one theory is dismissed as insufficient as a matter of law. And in the nature of this case, for example, if the president, in America, you have a First Amendment right to give as much money to your own campaign as you like. So if he was the one paying off Stormy Daniels, even if it was solely for a campaign purpose, that's patently constitutionally protected and completely lawful and legal, unlike what Hillary Clinton did with the Russiagate dossier, unlike what Barack Obama was trying to do in getting a $30 million contribution from one member of the Fugees, as Leonardo DiCaprio testified this week, unlike what the Clintons did in the 1990s en masse. This was entirely lawful. And so instead, they're going to try to suggest that maybe he didn't really want to give it the money, then maybe he did want to give him the money, and maybe it was part of the plan, and maybe it wasn't part of the plan. This is why the indictment's extraordinary, and it says that Trump violated a federal law, but fails to even tell him which law it was he violated. That's how nuts it is. So from a legal perspective, from a factual perspective, from a political perspective, it may be the worst and weakest indictment ever brought. And as you note, what it really is an indictment of the American criminal justice process that has been so politically weaponized, it can be used in a way that makes America a laughingstock to the world.
Indeed, laughingstock is the phrase I quoted RFK Jr. Just a few moments ago. And this is another part of the laughingstock. I mean, you are famous for continuing to call ex-presidents Mr. President. If Trump were to go to jail, he would have to be accompanied in jail by his Secret Service detail, who would have to protect him inside the jail. And is this really all about paying money to a slattern, as my good friend Lionel dubbed her?
That's what they're trying to make it about. But in fact, I think they thought it would politically embarrass Trump. But the reality is Trump, that was baked into the cake politically about Trump. Nobody thought that he was necessarily a paragon of Sunday school virtue when it came to his personal life. Now, Trump, of course, has denied there ever was an affair. Stormy Daniels has at different times denied there was an affair. It depends on the circumstances. But it's very much like what happened with Clinton in the 90s. In that, when they decided for various reasons they couldn't go at the real corruption, they went after Monica Lewinsky, and that backfired in the court of public opinion. And this will, and already has as well. I think they really thought it would take Trump out, that it would allow DeSantis a path to the presidency. And DeSantis has been a deep state recruit for a very long time, going back to his days at Yale and Harvard, Guantanamo and Fallujah. You don't get those kind of assignments unless you've got some key patrons and allies inside the military-industrial complex. And they were convincing him to run on the grounds that Trump would be taken out politically by these indictments. But looking at Georgia, looking at D.C. But the reality is the country looks at this and they see it as an embarrassment. They see it as a joke. They see it as a crock. Even a majority of Democrats in some public opinion polls say this is a political indictment, not a law-based indictment. And so I think it shows how weak the deep state is in the West, how scared they are of Trump or anybody challenging, questioning, contesting deep state power. Much as President Kennedy did, much as Robert Kennedy did, and much as Robert Kennedy Jr. is now doing by campaigning for the presidency. So I think it reflects ultimately their weakness rather than their strength, that all they could come up with as a manufacturer is that somebody who was the victim of extortion, that's what Trump was here. So Stormy Daniels was connected to some extortion-related lawyers. Her former lawyer, Michael Avenatti, is in federal prison as we speak for doing what? Extortion. So Trump was basically the victim of extortion. His lawyer pays it off to avoid embarrassment to Trump's wife, Melania, and now Trump is the one being prosecuted. It is utter insanity. But it's what happens when you breach the dam of lawfulness in America. Once you go after people like Julian Assange and you try to criminalize the freedom of press and freedom of speech anywhere in the world, chances are that dam is going to break and it's going to reach more people and more protected categories, and that's what sadly happened.
Finally, and Councillor, you are good, I must say. Where does this go from here? What's the next stage we should be looking out for?
So the president's going to bring motions to recuse because the judge has issues of bias. The prosecutor has issues of bias. Motions to disqualify, as they're sometimes called here in America. The judge apparently was trying to do secret donations under disclosure requirements to the Biden administration. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. Then you're going to have motions to potentially transfer the case from Manhattan to Staten Island. Then you have motions to dismiss on constitutional grounds, statute of limitations grounds, failure to even state what crime he's being charged with grounds. So you're going to have a lot of legal activity before you ever reach a trial. You may never get a trial, and if the courts are honest in New York, they'll just dismiss this case and move on and just let it be a perilous precedent that's never repeated, hopefully, in America's near future.
And meanwhile, Trump goes on. Any noticeable dip in his morale over the whole thing?
None at all. It's one thing that they think that a lot of confession through projection, and that kind of like what you see with Russia and Ukraine in the sense that they try to project onto Putin a weakness and cowardice that they themselves often have. They figure if they were prosecuted, they would run for cover. Trump's always been just the opposite. If you punch him in the mouth, he's going to come back and punch you twice. He's a true New Yorker, but from the outer boroughs. He's a Queens man at heart. And that's why he got into trouble in prep school, was when he was beating up the other kids. So the nature of him is he doesn't respond well to being bullied, and he has rebounded back twice. In fact, has got more energy than he had before, and the whole country and his base is rallying behind him. So I think the deep state bought off a lot more than they can chew in this case.
Is his wife standing by him?
Oh, completely, and she sees it for what it is. And, you know, it's probably true with Trump. Stormy Daniels may not be on that list. Trump has certain standards. So he might not have gone that route. So I think that's what Melania assumes. A different accuser might have caused her a little more consternation than Stormy Daniels.
Robert Burns, you are a revelation. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.